Now that I've given you an overview, let me once again officially welcome everyone to the next generation of Homeland Security, Network, People, and Processes. Today's event is sponsored by the Leadership for a Networked World program and the Government Innovators Network. And we'd like to begin today, as we do every event, with an audience composition poll. And if you would, just please click on your the display slide in front of you, the category that best represents your profession. We have a couple of other polling questions that we will be administering periodically throughout today's event. And if you see a polling slide appear in front of you, you can just click the option that best suits you at your leisure. It looks like we have a very diverse audience, and without any further ado, let me turn things over to our moderator, Stephen Goldsmith, the Dan Paul Professor of Government here at the Kennedy School and former Mayor of Indianapolis. Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Jim. Jerry Mechling, also of Kennedy School, and I will kind of share the moderation responsibilities. I want to welcome everybody. And particularly thank Kshemendra Paul, Chief Enterprise Architect at Justice, and Sue Reingold, Deputy Program Manager, Director of National Intelligence Office, and Jeff Brady from the FBI's National Joint Terrorism Task Force, who are presenting. We, as Jim mentioned, are going to archive the results of this discussion, and it will be available over the Government Innovators Network at the Kennedy School. And we find from previous panels on other subjects that these conversations are regularly accessed by people kind of studying the areas. Let me just say, by word of introduction, the issue that we're discussing today seems to be emerging at the forefront of a number of different government areas, but the intelligence and security area in particular, and with dramatic enhancements in technology, the ability to weave together horizontal solutions is greater than ever before, but more plagued by bad contracting, bad monitoring, inadequate vision, poor rulemaking, etc. So we have some really tremendously insightful folks in this conversation today. And we've been looking at this. Jerry's been looking at it, Mechling, from an IT standpoint. I've been looking at it from the perspective of how does local government interact with state and federal government. So we've got both the horizontal issues across government bureaus, as represented by the speakers today, and then we also have those kind of cascading issues into local government. And it seems with the enormous amount of information flowing around that needs to be processed for purposes of protecting our country and our cities, that getting this thing right, how to create a networked response, is particularly important. And we have some resources that we'll be posting on our website to support this conversation as well. So with that, let me turn the program over to Jerry and ask him to discuss a little bit what he's been doing and to help start the conversation. Jerry.
Thanks, Steve. I'm delighted to try to do that, although people told me to summarize my last 30 years in 3 minutes. That may be a little bit difficult. I'll do the best I can. The subject that we're looking at, I think is, as you said, Steve, a very critical one. I would like to address it as 3 questions. The first question, if we're looking at cross-boundary work in the Homeland Security area, is why do we have boundaries in the first place? The second question is, why is the cross-boundary issue so interesting and so important right now? And then some of the general points about what seem to be the issues in getting this cross-boundary coordination and work together working right. And in each case, I hope to learn a lot about how these general ideas apply in the area of Homeland Security. So let's start with the why boundaries. The graphic is showing a group of people working together to produce something and give it to somebody else. The advantage of working together in a group is that we gain a lot of benefit when people can work at a greater scale and when people can specialize in their own work because they have some comparative advantages that they want to take advantage of. And they have some personal interests that they want to go to. So the first line of work says all those people are specialized, and it's good because they get very good at what they do. What's not so good is we have to coordinate it all. And the real question around coordination is, how does that happen? The first thing that happens is we need to recognize that if people share the goal and can see where things stand, if things are transparent, and we can get a legitimate way to coordinate things together, that's what we're trying to do, and much of this will happen through self-organization if the goal is shared and things are transparent enough. But we found out over the years that just having people do what they want is often not as efficient as having people follow the rules, standard operating procedures. They can do whatever they want within those rules, but the rules help us coordinate things together, and if the rules don't let people do it alone, then we say, let's give you a hierarchy of authority. And the people in authority can much more quickly come to a decision in many cases than the people who have to negotiate among themselves. And the military has found that that's absolutely essential for life and death issues in many ways. And we have people who specialize in learning what the entire organization is trying to do. So we have a hierarchy of authority, and it's those authority boundaries that are very important. What those boundaries do is focus authority on particular sets of issues and limit the authority that tends to get abused by checks and balances and requiring them to stay within one area. So laws have been passed to have people do things, but not to do things outside of the authority established by the legislature. Organizations define their own units of authority. So in the Homeland Security area, we have a military set of activities, but we have a policing set of activities. In policing, we have street enforcers, street patrols, but we have detective work. In all of these areas, we've assigned a hierarchy of authority to coordinate things. The interesting part is that in an information technology-based world, we're finding that many of the transactions and communications that need to be coordinated go outside and cross these boundaries of authority. So, important question is, how does that happen and what's required? What does information technology do? It really does three things. The first thing is it allows the handoff or the coordination with the customer to be done on a remote basis and not having to have the producer and the customer there at the same time. So we get fewer interruptions and trips. We have online, not inline. We have 24/7 service, a pretty good thing, and we need to think about what that means in sharing information in the Homeland Security region. A bigger change happens when we use information flows to allow self-service to take place both inside on the production and with the customer. So we have many fewer handoffs, reduce the delays in all this operation. And in the third way, things that happen, pretty important, is very often in an information-intensive world where we can see things, we can outsource stuff. We can say what used to be our own production can be handled better by somebody else who's specialized in what was support for us and it's strategic for them. So we set up new boundaries between the program, the agency, the enterprise, the jurisdiction, the industry, the nation. All of these, again, are defining accepted lines of authority. And here we start then to break them, because we can go outside for networked service and organization. And in fact, in a world where communication and transportation is so much easier than it used to be, more and more of the important things that are happening are on a cross-boundary basis. Certainly, Al-Qaeda is a networked organization that finds that it can coordinate its activities way beyond the boundaries of the individual organizations that are trying to control it. And if you've got networked challenges, you better have networked responses to deal with those challenges. So the key target then for how you use this technology to coordinate things are these four, I think. The first is to note that we can do online access. Very simple. One step, but it's been huge in terms of its impact on the world and much of what we've done over the last 10 years. We need to think about how this applies to help the Homeland Security community deal better in the customer and service relationships of the many organizations that are trying to respond. A bigger step is the enterprise integration, where we not only change delivery, but the entire production process inside current organizations. And the biggest step, and the one that we're really here to look at today, is when the entire community of practice has to be readjusted because things are different. That involves a lot of change by a lot of people, and from a customer's point of view, it may be that we're particularly looking at cross-boundary coordination and integration of the various services that can be applied or supplied by multiple organizations. So the end of this is that where the world up to now has focused very heavily on the delivery step, we're now involving more the production people and the other people in the industry that we're dealing with. There's a bigger return there because we can get more of the problem coordinated. But there's a bigger risk because some of the people may not want to do what we're doing, and we don't have a lot of the authority that we might like to coordinate things better. Some of the issues in general, and I'd like to explore these with the panel on how they apply to Homeland Security, are first, if the world is changing to allow us to communicate and to use these computer-based networks for a different kind of communication, we have to keep up with that. We have to find the differences that make a difference. We've got to keep encouraging technology search, and more importantly, encourage the experimentation that allows us to use that in different ways. In many ways, DARPA is a key example, looking backward 30 years, on how the military community required the development of an effort to really keep up here. The question is, do we have a similar effort emerging or that needs to emerge in the Homeland Security region? Second issue I would say is that if we're going to make a change, the cross-boundary change, it has an opposition very often. There are a number of people who, because people are people, they won't want to do these new ways to coordinate, these new relationships between detectives and patrol officers, between the FBI and local policing operations, between the states and the federal government. And a key there appears to be the negotiation key rather than the top-down, hard-ass leadership authoritarian key. And if we look at an example again, the role of TCP/IP that was brought into the world and sort of snuck up on things by allowing people to do things incrementally but quickly, reached a certain point where it was critical mass and had an incredible impact on all the e-commerce around the world and all the e-government around the world. Is having some impact, major impact, on Homeland Security. One of the questions, I think, is are there other examples of things like that to turn to now? And the final point I would make, or put forward to this group as an issue, is how do we take advantage of what may be some sneaky leverage through standards? That is, it's often under the radar that we can get to critical mass explosion, very much the way TCP/IP evolved. And then it took off and was incredibly powerful. Are there pretty much under the radar opportunities now in the Homeland Security area that we need to deliver and explore more? What I think is required to find those and use those is a kind of leadership that has three characteristics that are very important for the future, have always been important, but are really more important for the future than they have been in the past. One characteristic is leaders who are willing to be very active and shake things up. Cross-boundary changes are often not going to be consensus changes, and people need to convince others that there's a real problem here. The second characteristic for the leaders is that they not go alone, that they very explicitly be looking for network opportunities and partners. So it's a very partner-oriented leadership. It's looking not only outside the box, it's outside your box in your agency. And the third characteristic is we need leaders who are adaptive. That is, this is not a kind of problem where we're going to get things right or know how to get things right at the beginning. We have to try something and learn from it really quickly. Now, I've cast all of that as the general theme of cross-boundary as technology creates a new way to divide labor up. I haven't talked a lot about the Homeland Security applications there, but I think they're begging to be talked about, and I think there are some interesting examples, and I hope we put some of those on the table this afternoon. That gets us started. Steve, back to you. Now, that's all right. Let me go to our next speaker. I'm sorry to have taken quite so much time in the setup, but let's turn next to our presenter. Brady. Yeah, Jeff Brady. We'll cue things up here for now, and I'd like to hear, in particular, the Homeland Security specific kind of ideas and issues that you've been working with.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for allowing me to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to kind of, I guess, touch on a couple of the areas that Jerry Mechling just talked about. I'll flip to this next slide here. What I find in my experience looking at the information sharing initiatives that are out there, we really look at material and non-material solutions. You have the large complex issues with synchronizing all the different databases and software and systems, which is a daunting task, and a lot of the folks here are going to talk about that in a lot greater detail than I can even hope to fathom. And secondarily, I think you also have non-material solutions that involve the human factor, which is the interim solution while this effort is going on. And where I sit at the National Joint Terrorism Task Force, I think that is a good example of a non-material solution. The NJTTF basically was established just after 9/11, and it's a multi-agency task force that has 41 government agencies that are located inside the National Counterterrorism Center. The role or the mission is basically to do what it is we're talking about here, information fusion and information sharing. And because of the 41 different agencies and the approximately 100 different types of databases that we deal with, we've used the human element to try to make this information transfer occur, because technology isn't available to adapt at the rapid pace that we need to be able to do these things. Now, I've kind of broken down what I think some of the barriers to information sharing are. Again, I talked about the technological incompatibilities that we have. That's one of the dimensions of this problem, and probably one of the most daunting and task-oriented problems. Secondly, we have the human nature dimension, which humans traditionally resist change because it's foreign to them and it's not comfortable, and usually that can be overcome with time and explanation and the types of things that we're trying to do right now. I think the bottom 2 points that I have there are the more difficult ones to get a hold of. The organizational authorities and policies prohibit sharing information in specific purposes, and that leads to a cultural tendency not to share over time, which are 2 separate dimensions and have different things associated with them, but they're related. So what I see right now from the seat that I sit in, the majority of the government's effort in trying to enable greater information sharing is solving this technological problem, and that's extremely important. But I think my point is, while this is a monumental task, I don't think that this problem may necessarily solve our information sharing dilemma, similar to what Mr. Mechling talked about. I'd like to kind of take a look at why it is that terrorists seem to succeed in the international community to try to understand some of these issues. This may get a little dry, and I'll skip through it pretty quick. But basically, our international law is based upon relationships between nation states and their individual sovereignty concepts. And really, that sovereign authority, whether it's by country boundaries or by agreements, is a geographical phenomenon. However, terrorists, or those asymmetric type threats, learn to operate and exploit the seams in traditional international law, international geography, and agreements, because either the nations that they're operating the seams of are unwilling, or they're unable to stop the threat. So the authority and responsibility and response to terrorist threats are geographically limited unless you have a very close coordinated action between nation states, which is, I think, exemplified by the United States and Great Britain. Typically, however, the ability of the international global response is slow because many nations are not willing to compromise on any of their sovereignty issues. When you look at that empowerment of an asymmetric threat, and you compare that to how our government is organized, I think that you can draw analogies and show that we have similar vulnerabilities. Our structure, our authorities, and our responsibilities that we have as a government are similarly segregated and aligned with, defined roles, missions, and policies, and actually funding lines that are analogous to a territorial boundary. And therefore, I believe a terrorist asymmetric threat is able to operate in these governmental gaps and seams just like they can operate in the territorial gaps and seams of countries in the world. Now, our structure of our government is contained in the National Security Act of 1947, which was built on a Cold War paradigm of perceived conventional war, and it actually relied upon international agreements and treaties that are founded on concepts of sovereignty. Our governmental statutory authorities, policies, and procedures are DoD areas of responsibility for combatant commanders. Fiscal laws governing funding of these endeavors are not organized or structured very well, I don't believe, to combat terrorist threats. Now, the initial attempt to fix this problem, as most people know, was the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. But it came out in December of 2004, which was an attempt to consolidate and organize the intelligence community under one structure to combat the asymmetric threats. One of the things I look at in that statute, however, is that it kind of lacks the ability to operationalize that effort. So if you change the way the intelligence community works, but you don't change the way or the jurisdiction and the powers and the authorities of the entities that the intelligence community serves, you may or may not be successful in your attempt at fixing this systemic problem of dealing with an asymmetric threat. Slide. So the overarching question that we have is solving the technological problem. Is that going to solve the information sharing dilemma, or is there really a requirement for a total government restructure, another National Security Act of 2000 whatever, to combat modern terrorist threats? So in conclusion, I guess the question that I pose to the panel is that, do we need to redo the National Security Act of 1947 to help do this and change these jurisdictional boundaries, some of the boundaries that Mr. Mechling was talking about? And if you take a look at some of the modern examples that we read about in the papers, you can kind of see where I'm talking about. Just talking about port and border security and the jurisdictional issues that are associated with those types of issues, counterterrorism jurisdiction between inside the United States and outside the United States, the different immigration rules, all the different types of things. Are we going to be able to accomplish our goal of information sharing from the highest to the lowest level without a restructure of the overall government responsibilities and authorities and in the funding lines that go with it? So that's kind of the question that I pose and I lay out there. Subject to any other questions, I'll allow the next person to to make the presentation.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I think that's very important, and to my way of thinking, it highlights very much a tension that we've got between the need for top-down restructuring at some point, always bitterly fought in some ways, and hard to pursue, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of negotiation and a lot of leadership, but then try to clarify exactly which claims for new authority are necessary in the Homeland Security field now. And in contrast to that, how much progress can we make in sort of a bottom-up, mostly consensus, by letting folks continue to work on it? I'd like to come back to that after we get some more cards on the table here. Kshemendra Paul, who is the Chief Enterprise Architect of the U.S. Department of Justice, has some ideas to put us forward next.
Thank you. Just by way of introduction, I'm the Chief Enterprise Architect of the Department of Justice. I'm also the co-chair of the Services Subcommittee of the Architecture and Infrastructure Committee of the Federal CIO Council, and I'm the program executive for the National Information Exchange Model. Information sharing is a key imperative. It's important from an IT perspective. Within the department, we have 40 components ranging from FBI as the largest component to the litigating divisions and some smaller components, and a fairly diverse mission across all those different components. And so being able to have our systems talk to each other, talk to our customers is a key thing. It's also a priority from the Attorney General's perspective and frankly from the President's perspective. A few things that we're doing in the department that I wanted to highlight are law enforcement information sharing, an effort we're doing with our colleagues at FBI around sharing information with state and local law enforcement, making sure that we can do that effectively. We're also key participants and partners in the information sharing environment, and and in particular, we work very closely with our local, state, and tribal partners around information sharing issues. I think earlier, Professor Mechling talked about the role of architectural standards, and I think that's something that we've really found is crucial in our efforts to promote the information sharing agenda. And one of the things I wanted to get into a little bit here was the National Information Exchange Model, and talk about that. I'm wondering, Jim, if you can help me drive through my presentation.
We'll get it. Thanks, Kshemendra. We'll get it.
Okay, great, thanks. So we can go to the next slide, slide number 2. So looking at NEAM, the scope of NEAM is the payload. What we're doing is focusing on the precise data that goes in an information exchange. And I'd like to show this slide to highlight the fact that to do effective information sharing, you need to be able to share data in a way that the sender and receiver both think the data elements mean the same thing. But that's only the start. I think many others have highlighted the need to have the right policy framework. For example, privacy issues, security issues. You need to have the right mission context. You need to have networks that can actually carry this message back and forth. So while the data is particularly important and is a great starting point, I think the point that others have made, and one that I really want to emphasize, is that in many ways this is the easier part of the problem. The harder part is the governance frameworks and the policy issues. Next slide, please. The key architectural concept behind NEAM is this idea of a federated domain architecture. And what we're showing here is the interplay between governance and technical architecture. So let me explain. Around the petals of the flower that you're seeing are the different communities of interest or domains that are a part of NEAM, National Information Exchange Model. Now the justice domain is the largest and most mature, and in the past, the predecessor technology, Global Justice XML Data Model, was the justice domain. That's migrated now into the justice domain. Several of the other domains there are in the Homeland Security area: infrastructure protection, emergency management, immigration, international trade. The intelligence community is a part of NEAM also. So at the center of the flower, you see a universal set of a universal core. That's a very small, compact, stable set of essential data elements that everybody has to agree to, everybody understands. So the key information about a vehicle, a property, a person, identifier type information. Expanding out the circle, you've got the common area where you extend the data elements for two or more communities of interest that need to exchange information and agree, have common governance over the meaning or semantics of a data element. And then out in the domains, the justice domain, for example, you might find the details of a rap sheet or things like that. Today, there are active participation between, as I said, DOJ, DHS, and our state and local partners through the Global Justice Information Sharing Initiative. Next slide, please. NIEM is more than just the technical standards. It's also documentation, tools to help you actually package the data elements into information exchanges, training and technical assistance, and the governance and processes. One of the areas, and I think this is something that Sue's going to expand on that I wanted to highlight in the governance and processes area is the fact that we're working closely with the information sharing environment on functional standards, data exchange standards in a business context for specific mission areas, and extending the governance framework that the Information Sharing Council, Information Sharing Environment has into specific activities and projects across the different stakeholders. Just last slide, please. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I do want to highlight the fact that GJXDM migrating to NIEM is actually been around for a while and is in production use today. There are approximately 1 million law enforcement officers in the U.S., local, state, tribal level, federal level, across all the different aspects of the federal government. And those law enforcement officers are spread across about 18,000 different distinct entities, law enforcement organizations. Today, in operational support, there are GJXDM-based transactions that are supporting day-to-day operations. Things like sharing rap sheets, checking wants and warrants, driver's license checks across boundaries. So yeah, I can talk more about these later on, but just to, in the interest of time, I think that's really all I wanted to say from an opening remark perspective.
Thanks, Kshemendra. We do want to keep pushing here, although I find all of these issues, I would like to discuss them for days and weeks, if at all possible. However, let me turn over to Sue Reingold, who's the Deputy Program Manager and the Director of the National, in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Sue, can you put your ideas forward here, and then I think we'll have a better chance for back and forth.
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. What I'd like to spend a little bit of time doing is talking about national application of this cross-boundary work, which is called the Information Sharing Environment. But I want to emphasize a slightly different area. I'll be focusing on the importance of public-private partnerships. And I can't echo enough what a number of the speakers have already said, where the problem really is not technology. It has to do with changing culture, policy, and business process. So let me talk a little bit, talking about the information sharing environment. Basically, in December 2004, and someone had already mentioned the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. It was really the terrorism prevention side of the act that created and defined something called the information sharing environment. But the act really only did it in the most general of terms, and it defined it as an approach that facilitates the sharing of terrorism information, and that's pretty broad. And so what was really then left to the president and the program manager for the information sharing environment, because the act specified that there be a program manager, was to identify a more precise definition. And that definition actually went to Congress this last November as part of the Information Sharing Environment Implementation Plan. And basically, I'm just going to quote the definition. The definition talked about the environment as being a trusted partnership between all levels of government, the private sector, and our foreign partners to detect, prevent, disrupt, preempt, and mitigate the effects of terrorism against the territory, people, and interests of the United States of America. unquote. And basically the partnership, the whole point of this partnership is to enable the trusted, secure, and appropriate exchange of terrorism information across 5 different communities of interest. I'll get to that in a minute. And to and from state, local, and tribal governments, our foreign allies, and the private sector at all levels of security classification. So when I use the term terrorism information, if you see in the middle of the, I guess, the donut or whatever you want to call it there, for purposes of the information sharing environment, terrorism information is currently defined as terrorism, Homeland Security, and law enforcement information as it relates to terrorism. It took us a while to actually come together with a definition, but that's basically what's covered by the environment. One of the things I want to point out is that the ISE, it's not a new massive self-standing information system. If you think for a minute of these 5 communities, defense, diplomatic, law enforcement, Homeland Security, and Intel that comprise the ISC, think of them for a minute kind of metaphorically as 5 buildings that are filled with terrorism information, as I just defined it. What the ISC is, it's really a system of walkways, skyways, and corridors that connect those buildings. And the content, the actual terrorism information, will remain in all those buildings. But the people that are each in those 5 buildings, and the people on the side you'd see investigators, command and control, responders, operators, different sorts of disciplines, but basically the people in the 5 buildings will have better, faster, and fuller access to the information because of these walkways, skyways, and corridors. That is, it's because of the ISE. And the other thing to do is think about the buildings as having, within these communities of interest, as having federal, state, local, tribal officials inside, as well as private sector and foreign government personnel. So actually, the whole point is that the ISE is supposed to allow everyone to have proper, secure access to all the information for which a person is authorized. It also is supposed to authenticate the identity of all the individuals using those walkways and audit the use of the information. So the main point here is that the ISE, if you look at all the communities and the different levels, it's a trusted partnership that, and this is important, that utilizes business process and policy considerations to drive technology enablers and solutions. Let me talk for a minute about the program manager. As I mentioned, the law also program manager. And gave my office government-wide authority to plan, oversee, and manage this entity that I just described called the Information Sharing Environment. And so what we do is we assist the President and government agencies in the development and operation of the ISE and monitor and assess its progress. So really we're a coordination and collaboration function with an oversight authority. The law, interestingly enough, didn't identify, created a program manager, but it didn't say where in the federal government to place the program manager. And so the President assigned the program manager to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is where our home is. However, while we're assigned to the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, it's important to point out that we're not an intelligence component. We're not a member of the intelligence community. We like to say we're in but not of the intelligence community. Basically, the program manager's mandate is to work across all levels of government, as I mentioned, state, local, tribal, private sector, and with our foreign partners as well. So a couple important things have happened over the past year. To guide efforts to establish the environment, the law actually said to the President, you have to come up with some requirements and guidelines for the information sharing environment. So back in December of 2005, President Bush issued a memorandum to the heads of federal departments and agencies that said, here are my information sharing priorities, and I want you to go out and come back to me with some recommendations for implementation. A number of those recommendations were submitted to the President and approved for implementation just this past November 2006, and they were also incorporated into the Information Sharing Environment Implementation Plan. And I think on your resources page, you have a link to the ISC website. The plan is on there, as well as these presidential guideline recommendations. But as far as the collaboration side of things, the implementation plan and the presidential guideline recommendations, they resulted from extensive collaboration and with, again, federal and non-federal partners. And what we did is we leveraged the work that has been done, at least over the past 2 decades, by Groups such as the International Association of Chiefs of Police, national sheriffs, major city chiefs. The Department of Justice has an advisory group called Justice Global. The National Governors Association, the Department of Homeland Security has an advisory council, leveraged their work on fusion centers, U.S. Conference of Mayors, and on the private sector side, the critical infrastructure sector partnerships. Working with those folks, used them extensively in the work that they had done. So the whole point, I think, some of the speakers have been talking about is that we try to identify the value proposition up front, get everyone involved, leverage their interests so that when we actually came out with recommendations for things that people were going to need to go to implement, everyone agreed these are some solutions, and we're all going to move forward and do that together. So some of the priority areas that have been identified that people are working on, and one of them that Kshemendra just talked about is standards as well as architecture. There's a information sharing environment architecture framework that actually goes over the federal enterprise architecture, and utilizing standards is a way, and I don't even think it has to be, someone had mentioned that it can be kind of a under the radar way to get people to collaborate. I think this is actually an over the radar way where we're getting people together and they're agreeing to putting certain standards in place so that data can be collected and sent in a similar manner using these standards so that everyone can use it. Some other really important areas are connecting people through electronic directory services, started efforts and at the federal level to do that, put some of that in place. There's also President approved some recommendations to implement a federal, state, local, private sector information sharing framework that involves making sure that federally coordinated terrorism information makes its way in a timely manner to the state, local, and private sector environment, as well as takes advantage of these information sharing fusion centers that state and local governments have put together. Another area that's very important, we're in the process of making recommendations, is terrorism information handling. This whole issue of we really need standardized procedures for handling of sensitive but unclassified information. A lot of different procedures and policies, and if we can standardize this, it will really help people share information more quickly. I don't want to forget the areas of privacy and civil liberties. We've got and have developed privacy and civil liberties guidelines. Those are also available on our website for those who are interested. And the departments and agencies are in the process of developing their own guidelines against those. We've also worked those together with our state and local partners. And again, the area that's very important, promoting a culture of information sharing. So again, a lot of different areas that are being worked, and we do oversight of this through program budget review of the federal agencies, and we have a performance management plan that's due to Congress. The first one will be due this June, and then annually thereafter. I think that what I'll leave you with here is just, as we're kind of talking about process improvement and where things are, in the past, we've been in place about a year now, the program manager's office, and working together with the federal interagency as well as our non-federal partners. And this started out kind of, if you look at that ad hoc, we're kind of we've moved from ad hoc to a managed environment where common processes and information sharing sources, they're identified but not yet followed across the board. Over the next 3 years, which is the duration of the Information Sharing Environment Implementation Plan, we'll really move to, the idea is to move to a more defined and an optimized environment, whereas I started out by saying, your policy, your business process, and your technology are aligned so that basically the right people can get the right information at the right time. So that's just a quick overview of what we're all about, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
in fact, that's what we need to go to right now. I know there's been a number of questions about the concrete examples that need to be drawn from here. So I would like to encourage our audience to follow up with questions that are either of clarification or in particular questions for the implications of what we're doing, what the priorities for the next steps are. But we have one question that came in from the audience about the need for real-world examples. For example, the fusion centers, there's a person from northeastern Ohio who has been working on the fusion center concept and the TEW involvement. And it doesn't appear that there's been much involvement with the private sector. I hope I've gotten the question correctly. Would you, Susan, or Kshemendra, or Jeff want to address that?
Sure. This is Sue. I can take that on. You're absolutely right. That's actually one of the biggest challenges is how do you integrate what's going on at the state and local level in terms of the different terrorism early warning groups, that's TEW, and the fusion centers. And one of the goals, actually, of the information sharing environment and the presidential framework I talked about in terms of the information sharing framework is to bring in the private sector and help align that. And so a couple of very concrete things that are going on is again, the president actually directed that we work together with you at the state and local level to create an integrated national network of state and major urban area fusion centers. And obviously the Department of Justice, the FBI, and Department of Homeland Security provide most of the funding, technical assistance, and training that goes along with that. And there are actually some best practices around the country where, for instance, in Seattle, along with the Joint Terrorism Task Force there in the state and the city, they actually have starting to integrate the private sector, and there are other good examples as well. What we're going to be doing over the next couple of months is working with the critical infrastructure owners and operators through the DHS has a whole sector partnership structure. They're going to be setting up a group working with also the state Homeland Security directors and others to talk about how do we integrate the private sector infrastructure owners and operators with what's going on with the fusion centers. So again, a big challenge, but everyone seems to be willing to come to the table and do that. So that's definitely on our plate, and you'll see some things coming out of that.
Thanks very much. We have another question in that says, how does the work on architecture and standards involve OASIS technical committees for defining XML for related domains and the Transatlantic Secure Collaboration Partnership with the defense and intelligence contractors in global government agencies? We have a group that I'm pretty sure has addressed some of those issues. Would either of you like to come in on that one?
Sure, yeah, this is Kshemendra. With the NEAM, when we started actually going back to GGXDM, and then when we, about 2 years ago, signed the MOU to do NEAM with the Department of Homeland Security and move forward, we did a survey of technical standards and things like that, and I think we're using the OASIS XML standards as the basis for what we're doing. It's our intent to stay aligned with standards in the that are industry-based, that are based on established standards organizations. One thing in particular that we're doing now that's kind of coming up is something called the Justice Reference Architecture. This is something being driven out of the Global Justice Information Sharing Initiative, the Advisory Act Committee that we talked about earlier. That's a collection of many different organizations in the justice and public safety area, and they're basing their reference architecture for on the OASIS standards, and then in particular looking at different service implementation packages, and the Web Standards Service Implementation Package is also based in particular on the OASIS Web Service Standards. There's more information on that on the OJP website, and I don't have that's the Office of Justice Programs. I don't have that URL at my fingertips, but we can probably get that later today or tomorrow, and make sure we include it in the collateral around this meeting.
Thanks very much, Kshemendra. And in fact, one of the questions that came in that I will put all our panelists on the spot for was to say, gee, there's a lot of information in these presentations, and it's a little hard to digest it on the fly. Will these be made available for on the website afterwards? And so let me just go around the table and ask, will they?
This is Kshemendra. Yeah, I have no problem with mine. I see one typo. I just want to fix that, but other than that, no problem.
We'll let you do that. Sue?
Yes, I can also make it available.
Super. Jeff?
Yeah, that's fine. I think I have one typo as well, but other than that, that's...
that lets people know it's been real and up to date, and we're working on the edge here. I think that would be a fine thing to do, to have that. We're getting fairly near the end of the official time. I'm going to let it roll on as long as there's an audience here to at least 15 after if we want to. But one of the questions that comes up on sharing information and what we're doing both with standards and the allowance of bottom-up sort of self-coordinated work, and in some cases the need for authoritative redesign to change the chain of command and the budgeting authority and the who is in charge of various things. A question is the degree to which we're actually getting results. Are we getting much more sharing now within the Homeland Security community, and if so, how do we know? And or are we on the cusp of something that will really take off soon? Do we expect that the progress pattern has been such that we're going to see some inflection in the curve? Are we going to be getting much better? Should we expect that? Or do we see it still as a fairly tough slog ahead?
Well, it's a good question. I think people can absolutely expect it to get better, but it's going to, at the same time, it will be tough slogging because people, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but in general, people, they say they want to share, but on the other hand, they also still want to control their information. And until they have a level of comfort that their information sometimes is going to be protected properly, and that means putting the right information assurance and making sure the appropriate standards are there. Until some of those things that are in place, people are not as agreeable to sharing. So I think what we're seeing, and we've seen definitely a sea change in terms of federal departments and agencies. We have something called the Information Sharing Council, which is 17 different federal departments and agencies that meet every week or so about the information sharing environment. And everyone really wants to try to make a difference and move things forward. But indeed, in some cases, there are policies in place that impede that. So what you'll see, I think, over the next year is trying to identify what those are, changing those where possible, and issuing standard policies for the environment. The program manager can do that and ask everyone to follow that. And so you'll see some movement along that. But it's really the culture change. I mean, the technology can enable it. It's there to do it, but the culture is a difficult thing to move.
Very interesting. Do either of the rest of you want to comment on that?
This is Kshemendra. I think that Sue is spot on. I do want to highlight a couple of things, though, that where there are point examples where we're doing a good job of information sharing. I think with GJXDM, the Global Justice XML data model, there's lots of interesting success stories. People are very familiar with Amber Alerts, for example, which allows folks to share information and contemporaneously with in terms of incident response between law enforcement jurisdictions and also between law enforcement and transportation. Think about how it gets from a police officer to a police department to a road sign in a different state. There's actually a lot of governance and activity that went on to make that happen, to enable that. A national sex offender registry. There was also it's also a success story about data standards and like that. The fact that there's about 20 different transaction types around wants and warrants and checking driver's license across jurisdictional boundaries. So I think that there's the seeds of these things, and also there's sharing of law enforcement information between state, local, and federal, and through the Department of Justice's RDEX system in the in Seattle and also in San Diego now. So there's these early efforts. They are making a mission impact today, and I think there's more to do, especially as we look at the broader problem. But I think that there's a good base there.
Mm-hmm. I have two ideas now. One is to note that however much we discuss and however fast we talk in the next 15 minutes, we're unlikely to thoroughly cover all these topics. One place for people who are interested in more depth on this is, instead of talking for an hour, we're going to be working these issues for 2 solid days on March 21 and 22 at Harvard. For those that are interested, we'll give you some more information on that at the end of this. My question of the panelists, though, is, as I've been listening, maybe I haven't heard all that's going on out there, in that I've heard very much a focus on the coordination on a cross-boundary basis in the enforcement communities broadly defined, the government workers broadly defined. It's plausible that an incredible amount of the actual new behavior to respond to terrorist threats and respond effectively will be sort of on the part of individual citizens and the private sector. To what extent will the work that we're doing now need to address the particular priorities that citizens can take and firms can take above and beyond what the government can do?
This is Sue, and I think again that's an excellent point. It's true. I think the focus has been on at a government and non-government partner, but I haven't talked about the public in terms of processes and policies and such that can be put in place. And I think the priority was to start there because that's where it's been the most broken. And until the government gets its act together a little bit better, it's hard to assist and help citizens. But that will be an important component. And I know that places like the Department of Homeland Security and others have been having town hall meetings and trying to incorporate the public into what they do. So what we'll, at least from where I sit, what we'll be looking to do is be looking to those federal agencies who have a greater role with the public, and even the Health and Human Services. I mean, you've got in terms of public health, you've got a lot of areas where preparedness and response in terms of working with the public and helping to share information and make them feel more prepared and like they can take action. So that's a next logical step as part of all of this. But as I said, I think we have to get ourselves in a better position in order to help our communities. The only other thing I'll add is that I think at a state and local level, you already have your mayors, your governors, your mayors, your local law enforcement who are working very closely with their local communities. And so I think that's going on there right now as well.
Thanks, Sue. Actually, your ideas here have provoked Cheryl Murray to ask a follow-up question that came a little bit earlier but relates to what you just said. Cheryl says, could Sue go into more detail on the Seattle best practice that you mentioned? I'm particularly interested in how the partnerships with the private sector was achieved. We've had experience with the private sector coaching one another not to work with local law enforcement and to only report, for example, through the PCII program.
Oh, okay. And I think, and I don't know if Jeff has any experience from the national JTTF with what went on in terms of in Seattle. Seattle, I gave as an example. And they're in the process of bringing in, I can give you New Jersey as an example. I can think of a couple of different states and cities who have actually set up critical infrastructure advisory committees where they've invited in representatives from companies that are either headquartered or have, a company within their a jurisdiction to basically talk to them about how they can share information, how they can prepare for some sort of an incident. And so it's really all about setting up some sort of a governance model. In the Seattle and Northwest area, there's something called the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, where the private sector has organized themselves along with the state. It's been going on for quite a few years. You could actually check this out on the web as well. And offline I can give you some references if you'd like. But there's been a lot of really terrific work where basically people are partnering on a regional level regardless of whether they're government or non-government, and trying to work together to see how they can make sure that there's better communication and sharing of information. Now, this does not get passed, and you mentioned protected critical infrastructure information. You said PCII. The private sector still, there's information that, in terms of vulnerability information, such that they do not wish to share. And there are processes being put in place to help alleviate, again, their concern that they share information about vulnerabilities, that this will impact their competitiveness. And that's part of the information sharing environment and creating a trusted environment, as I just mentioned. So there are still a lot of issues out there, but I think, again, you see a willingness, particularly regionally, to partner in all sorts of areas across the country.
Richard Stein has sent in a question that relates not so much to the information that is to be shared as to the people to whom it's to be shared with. His question is, do you think that one of the challenges involves individuals and organizations not knowing who they need to share information with versus people not wanting to share information? It seems that components that have a, quote, need to know of certain information are not known to those who have that information. Do we need to do a better job of defining who does what? How big is that as a priority as you folks see it?
I can jump in again. I didn't know. Anyone else want to take it?
I would like to make one comment. This is Jeff Brady.
Yeah, Jeff.
It's unfortunate. I know that there was some talk of having Governor Jim Gilmore come on, and we've been working off and on with him through the Kennedy School and some of the things that he's doing with that with NCORE. And what I think NCORE is the National Council on Readiness and Preparedness has done is identified that there is kind of a gap. It's in the for lack of a better term, the belly button, or whatever you want to call it, for the private sector, and how that whole relationship is going to work between the federal government, the state and local government, down to the private sector. And they're working on putting together a pilot kind of a test program of 5 cities. They've gone around and done regional conferences to kind of capture best practices. And they had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Boyd over at DHS, who's in charge of interoperability and continuity for DHS. And I think they've come to an agreement that they're going to try and do this pilot test sometime in the fall to try to, at least examine the issue of getting that information from the federal government down to the private sector, and do some tests with various different pilot cities to try and work out how we can do it, what some of the issues are as far as policy problems, statutory problems, other types of information sharing problems. And if he was here, he could talk a lot better on the program. But I thought I would bring that up. And Tony Loftily here from the Kennedy School has been monitoring and assisting in that endeavor. So from the private sector standpoint, I wanted to bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
The way that some of the things that Sue talked about, the efforts in the different JTTFs through the different states are as varied as the colors of the rainbow, because every state and every locality and every jurisdiction is different. So Seattle is doing some things. Atlanta, Georgia is doing some things. There are a whole lot of different efforts that are being led by local leaders in those communities and the local JTTFs and field offices that are there to try to improve the relationship between the federal government and work out ways as well to get law enforcement information down. The comment about understanding who needs what and the different audiences, I think, is a valid point as well. I think there is a lack of information at the federal side, I think, on some of the requirements at the private sector side, and vice versa. I think there's a lack of understanding and information at the private sector about what the federal government brings to bear. So I don't think I added any clarity to that except to acknowledge that I believe that's a valid point.
We're going forward here. We're going to have time for only a couple more one more question from the group, and then I think we'll go around the panel and have each of you folks give an opportunity to say sort of where you think we've come from and what will be most important in going next. But Neil O'Brien submitted a question who says that this is an interesting discussion about removing policy impediments to information sharing, but what new incentives are being considered to encourage agencies to share information and to get the private sector to share information? Does either of our panelists want to take that one on?
Yeah, I'd like to. This is Kshemendra. I'd like to chime in and actually tie the answer back to the previous question. One of the things that we're doing at the Department of Justice and through our involvement with the Information Sharing Council is supporting the implementation plan that calls for something called Common Terrorism Information Sharing Standards. And so, one of the things that one of the areas where we're trying to develop these Common Terrorism Information Sharing Standards is around suspicious activity reporting. Now, the key to making that work is, and the end product there is a set of data standards, but the key to making it work is looking at an overarching business scenario, looking at the policy issues, privacy concerns, and things like that at the different levels. But the key, being clear on what's the value proposition for each element of that value chain, right? So, the police officer, the local police department, the state fusion center, et cetera. So, if you can be clear about what the value proposition is, then, and there usually is a pretty compelling value proposition around standards, around lower cost, better quality, local interoperability, and things like that. So, it's been my experience, I think, by really thinking about the business case for doing these things, the business case has value to all the participants.
Thanks, Kshemendra. In our last pass through the panel, what I would like to do is ask each of the panelists to summarize. You've heard our conversation, you've heard what's been asked, you've heard what hasn't been asked. As we sort of close this session, any parting advice you have on how we're going to make progress on all the needs for cross-boundary information sharing in the Homeland Security domain? Let me go in the way that we started and start with you, Jeff.
Well, I know there are an awful lot of people doing an awful lot of hard work trying to get things to happen. I think one of the people that hit on a little bit, I think we can do a better job as a government informing the public about what we're doing and the efforts that we're making, and trying to make them a part of the process, not being the federal government just stepping in and creating a solution without making them feel a part of it. I think Sue touched on that as well. So I echo that, and I know that the FBI and the Department of Justice are trying to make that an effort, a reach-out effort. There are a lot of people that are working very hard on that.
Super. Thanks, Jeff. Kshemendra, do you have some parting advice for us?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Thank you all for including me today. This has been a very interesting discussion. I wanted to go back, Jerry, to what you finished in your opening remarks when you talked about the need for active, partner-oriented leadership. I think that it can be daunting to think about how do you do information exchange between government entities or at a national level. But I think that there are a lot of ingredients, and I would encourage people to be optimistic and to take to heart the advice to be proactive, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough, and to pursue the information sharing with a degree of alacrity.
Thanks very much, Kshemendra. Sue, what's your parting?
Well, again, thanks for the opportunity. I think, again, going back to something you said at the beginning also was this idea of shared goals. And I can't emphasize enough that all of you, to improve information sharing, it's a collaborative effort, and it's worked together with a lot of different partners, listening to stakeholders, and figuring out where everyone needs to go together, and that's through those shared goals. So again, kind of emphasizing the collaborative nature, the importance of partnerships, figuring out governance structures, and again, finally, I'll just emphasize once again that we really need to figure out what policy and business work through our policy and our business process. Whatever it is we need to do, are the right policies in place to allow us to do it? Do we really know what's our business process for getting it done? What does it need to be? And only when we have figured those things out can we turn and say what technology solution will help us get this done. And so I guess that's my final word.
Super. Thanks, Sue. One of the fun things about being here when Steve leaves and has to was he let me close this thing. He opened it up. Let's close it down a bit. But I think we've been working on what truly represents the next steps, the next wave, the next big set of problems that if we're going to change and keep government up with the challenges it faces, that we've got to deal with. And those are very much cross-boundary kinds of concerns. We've made a lot of progress with each program working to deliver its services online, not inline. We've done that. We still have a lot to do on that, but that is so much easier than really changing the production process among the entire interrelated set of private sector, individual, and government agencies that have to coordinate on a lot of fronts, be it healthcare, education, or in this domain, Homeland Security. I think the attractive part of that challenging problem is that Homeland Security bubbles right to the top as something that everybody sees the problem. We've got a problem, we've got to do something about it, and yet it's been very hard to do what we've done so far. I've been educated this afternoon to see more of the details of what's going on, and I look forward to both the postings of the individual presentations and to sessions like this where we can share information, because a lot of what's going on that's effective is going on sort of all over the globe, as it were, and it's hard to get people together. This kind of technology that does allow us to come together is a big advantage in this way. And for those who can get on an airplane and come to Cambridge and Harvard and work with us on March 21 and 22, that's an excellent way to do things as well. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Kshemendra. Thank you, Sue. And thanks all those folks who stayed on not only until 4 o'clock, but until 4:17 or so. We appreciate it. We need progress on this problem. It's a big problem. I'm encouraged and looking forward to what we're doing next. Thanks again. So long.
Bye-bye.
Bye.